Grace Helbig, Hannah Hart, Maitreya Fedor, a work of pure genius, the caliber of which we are not likely to see again in the near future. 2016, Electra Woman and Dyna Girl. Did I seriously make that grandiose of a statement about Electra Woman and Dyna Girl? Yes, I did. Quick synopsis. In the 1970s, there was a TV serial that was Electra Woman and Dyna Girl, of which the movie is the movie version. I never saw the original. I remember some shows from the 70s, bits and pieces, flipping channels. I was really little. I never knew that this franchise existed until it existed again in 2016. I heard about it off and on, and finally a couple of years ago, I sat down and watched the movie. I did watch some of the originals on YouTube. I watched the movie. I enjoyed the movie. I watched it a second time later on. I think I actually did a review of the movie, an older version of a review, and now I just watched it again. Every time I watch Electra Woman and Dyna Girl, I find something new. Being a franchise that has moved from the small screen to the big screen, like those things that move from cartoons or comic books to the big screen, there's that whole danger of losing your identity and what you're all about. And that ultimately is what the whole movie is about, Electra Woman and Dyna Girl. About franchises being abused, misused, selling out. We get our two protagonists. They're somewhere in Ohio. They are the superheroes, though they have no powers. We meet them immediately in costume, the grubby apartment where they live, the dinky junker car that they drive around, their evil next door neighbor that's always treating them like dirt, a high school girl, Bernice, who comes over and picks on them. They do stop an armed robbery at a local store, complete with the amusing antics and the funny quips from the partner, Dyna Girl. Everything you'd expect from an old, simpler time of superhero show, and yet it clearly is, well, it's giving us this vision of their existence in this world. Conveniently, because the evil next door neighbor is doing a report for careers and doesn't have parents, and her foster parents are, as she described them, professional government teat suckers. She comes over to the two superheroes to ask about their career, even though they don't like each other, and she picks on them and they give it right back to her. This sets up then the obvious opportunity to tell the story of this universe, that there were superheroes and supervillains. There was something called the Shadow War. Many of the heroes were destroyed, but the villains are all gone. In a world without supervillains up to this point, there's a handful of heroes, some with powers, some without, but with costumed identities trying to make the world a better place, living up to the dreams of their ancestors. Again, it drives home the whole theme of taking the original Superman, the Marvel Comics, Captain America, any of these big franchises from comic books, moving them into the big screen. First, Superman was a show, a campy show long ago, moving these things into the big, overdone, cinematically huge, loaded with special effects, sort of cinematic universes. And there's a whole bunch of digs at this throughout the movie. Electra Woman and Dyna Girl, after stopping the armed robbery, they go viral on something that is like social media in this universe. They don't use the brand names, obviously. They get invited to meet an agent who apparently, as we had learned previously, this large corporation has been acting as representative for superheroes, getting them endorsement deals, TV commercials, providing the laboratories to give them better equipment, cooler uniforms, fancy vehicles, even biological implants we get a reference to. In return, they make money back by marketing out these superheroes. They literally invite Electra Woman and Dyna Girl to do what other heroes have done and sell out for big money. And of course, obviously, the metaphor is obvious. And part of this is the cool, flashy new costume, the cool new equipment, the cool new car, which is a cool part of the story. You get all of this extra stuff. Now you've moved from the Marvel comic or the DC comic or even the small screen and the cartoon to the big time. You are now the DCEU, you are the MCU, except in this universe, it's the real life equivalent. Superheroes that were local, with primitive equipment, primitive costumes, doing the best they could for their neighborhood, moving up to be on talk shows and interviewed and be part of this big, flashy. Again, the commentary to all of this is pretty obvious. They managed to stay true to their source material by giving us Bernice, the next door neighbor, becomes the supervillain, the first supervillain of the new era, the Empress of Evil. She's not a complicated character. Just like a lot of the comic books, Spider-Man knew Harry Osborn, knew Mr. Osborn before the whole Goblin thing happened. A lot of people you knew ended up being on the other side. Just like that, we get a simplistic setup where the teenage girl that happened to be their neighbor, who didn't like them and was obnoxious, she's at that age where puberty has kicked in and her superpowers manifest, and she's the bad guy. And we get no specific backstory about why she's so evil. She just enjoys being evil. Although, coming from the tradition of the original Electra woman and Dyna girl, coming from the tradition of like the 60s Batman, where there's a basic right and wrong, good moral story, it is interesting that Bernice, what we learn about her is that she was an orphan with no parents, and her foster parents were living off the government. Essentially, that was the benefit they got from having her. They didn't really want to be parents. So she's the child that grew up without any real guidance, without parents, who actually talks about Snapchat at the beginning and mentions seeing people naked on Snapchat in an interesting exchange. She's the young teen who has run amok without guidance, without morals, without values, without family life to bring her up. She sort of becomes this bad person without any in-depth description of it, which is sort of neat. There's all these sort of traditional basic moral messages about, you know, raising your kids, and kids need people and need good role models, which is ultimately what Electra Woman and Dyna Girl are all about. Setting a good example, doing the right thing by their neighborhood. And after they've sold out, of course, Dyna Girl has trouble with it increasingly. Running around half naked to do a commercial for an energy drink is not something she wants to do, and the pair end up breaking up. We get an agent who is over the top, like an 80s corporate guy you would picture. We don't see him do drugs, but he's like the cocaine-fueled, obnoxious stereotype of the 80s corporate stooge that just wants everything to be hyped in order to make a profit, and he doesn't care about anything real. We get the director of the TV commercial for the energy drink, who is clearly addicted to the product, and he's always drinking it, and he's always, wow, out of control, worse than cocaine, 80s guy, out of control, and planning to turn the two heroes into sex symbols, and the way he put it, that every prepubescent boy in America will come of age to thinking of them. And of course, they're like, I don't think that's a goal we had set for our image. Again, the perfect commentary on the over-commercialization, the over-hype of all of this stuff, the overdone gadgetry. It builds up to where we finally get the Electra car. The new version of the Electra car has been in the process of being built through the whole of the film. And it shows up, and it's super cool, and it's super cool for about 10 seconds before being destroyed. And we actually get witnesses to the battle with Empress of Evil, who give the fan version of color commentary. Like, that was such a cool car. I would have liked to spend more time with it, but it was really cool. And you looked really good standing in front of it. All of this sort of, you know, what they call now the metaverse, sort of being able to critique the situation. But the really fascinating part in this context is they're giving us this about themselves as sort of a larger commentary on fandom. But what's interesting too is that in the culmination of that, they don't actually pick on the fans. The fans aren't negative, and they're not something to be attacked, as we've seen with franchise after franchise attacking their own fandom as being quote unquote toxic. Part of the genius of the way the whole story and all of the dialogue, which is very well written, the genius of the way it comes together is it's filled with all sorts of foreshadowing, nuances. There's a lot of Easter eggs about things that will happen later. But this also becomes sort of a built-in commentary about things like the vastness of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. We get an interesting side story that, I've heard it like 3 times, having watched the movie 3 times at least, and it didn't occur to me till this time. The one guy who's a nerd who tells a story about his lost Frisbee, who was Jonathan Frisbee. And I was like, I know that's familiar, I gotta look that up. Of course, some of you may remember the Secret of Nim cartoon. Jonathan Frisbee was the character deceased before the beginning of the cartoon. His wife features in the cartoon, but everybody remembers him. And there's several times there's this moment of Jonathan Frisbee. Oh, that name. And this guy in this movie says he lost his Frisbee, never saw him again. Jonathan Frisbee. Hilariously well done. I think, and this is going to end up going on forever because I love this movie, but I think the most important part about this movie, seriously, the most important thing that it does and does well, right? Whereas it's not really super original. The 2 friends go off to a new life of success. They end up breaking up because the one absorbs the new life and the one doesn't want to sell out, right? They end up reconciling, of course, by the end when when Electra Woman realizes she was wrong and all this fame isn't worth it and gets back to her roots. There's nothing real complicated about that story, but it is an every human person story. I say that on purpose. What we used to call in literature, the everyman story. The every human being might live this narrative. Every human being in some context. The 2 friends from school, they have a dream of growing up and changing the world and of doing it together. They struggle for years in Ohio. They make the big time, and this breaks them up until one of them realizes that selling out was not worth losing her friend over. This could be any 2 people that started a computer company in their garage and became billionaires. This could be any 2 people that they were on the football team together in high school and dreamed of going to the pros together, but didn't. Every rock band that started out in a garage and ended up famous with 3 different members of the 5 than what they started with. You see, it's this pattern of the human story of coming of age, of growing up, of becoming absorbed into the adult world from your idealistic young dreams, of all the things we do wrong to each other because of our imperfection. And it's exactly what Electra Woman and Dyna Girl ends up being about. Underneath all the bells and whistles, underneath the gadgets, underneath the weird costumes, see? And that, my friends, this is why I'm wearing this jacket. This is what Captain America was about back in the day. It's what Iron Man was about. It's what heroes actually stood for, what Superman stood for, what you name it. It was about that basic human story of the struggle to do good against evil and the things that get in the way, including our own faults and how we get through them and how we hang together with people that we build these friendships with, relationships, family that we're related by blood or by marriage. It's this every human being journey through life of the idealistic dream versus the cynical reality, and finally pulling together to stand up for the idealistic dream against the cynicism of the world around us and the grim meat hook realities of the world that we are living in, of this universe. It's really good stuff. No, it's not particularly original in that context, but it's human. And it's done so well. This is what superhero movies are supposed to be about. Some of the really good ones are. I think Captain America, especially the first one, really captured it. And there's others, I won't go into all of them. But the loss of that potentially within all of the gadgets and bells and whistles and Easter eggs and the crossovers and the post-credit scenes is the real tragedy. And Electra Woman and Dyna Girl, of all things, give us a franchise true to its original intent, that basic heroism back in the 70s, updated slightly, but not an overdone, dark, gritty version of itself. It stays true to the source material, which so many don't, gives us the basic human story that's supposed to be underpinning all of this, not letting it be obscured by the bells and whistles. And finally, I always talk about this, it does that so well that there's nothing about the movie that's woke. There's nothing about it that is politically driven or motivated. You don't get discussion of that stuff because it's a human story. And I've said this many times, this ridiculous idea of representation that's out there, that I can't possibly, nobody can empathize with a character that's another human being unless they look like them and talk like them and want to have sex with the same kind of people that they do, and every other ridiculous box that has to be checked. Well, there's not people like me in this movie. Well, they're not from this planet? You're not human? Watching this movie about these two women, it ultimately made very little difference that they were women. Some of their dialogue and their behavior to each other when they were arguing was sort of more typically female than masculine, but that really didn't matter. It could be anybody's story, anybody in the human race. We grew up without all of that woke box checking. I watched Star Trek. I felt no different about Lieutenant Uhura than I did Pavel Chekhov or Captain Kirk, except maybe that Kirk was the more important character and sort of the bigger hero. Didn't think about the fact that, I can't familiarize with the communications officer because I'm not a black female. That's pathetic. And I'll tell you, kids are not born with that kind of ridiculous stupidity. If your kids are bringing that up, they were taught that. They were taught that by you or by the culture out there that's telling them, oh, you're not represented. Oh, look, that person's not represented. And it's total BS. There's a little bit of tension with Electra Woman and Dyna Girl where you kind of think, for a minute, you're like, oh, they're a couple. No, they're not. But they could be. I mean, are they? They do encounter men, but, the guys that they kind of talk about in a way that might be romantic are kind of jerks when they meet them because they're superheroes on the payroll of the corporation. And having watched the movie now at least 3 times that I recall, I don't know. I have no idea what these women's sexuality is. I have no idea if they're going to have boyfriends in the next movie, and they don't it makes absolutely no difference. There's the plot does not revolve around their oppression because they're a lesbian pair. The plot does not have a major subplot that relates to their sexual orientation or their race or none of that figures in it. In the end, it's just a story about 2 people who knew each other from school, who had a dream they shared, that worked together, that broke up for a while, went different paths. Now they're back together. They end triumphantly as this team. It's well done. It's well put together. It's enjoyable to watch. There's enough fun stuff in the dialogue that you chuckle at it, and yet it's not really a comedy. It's a parody of these bigger franchises, and yet it's not really. It kind of stands on its own as a commentary about it, and yet not really. Not so much so that it's not like Superhero Movie, which is a dirty, obscene comedy meant to be a parody of it. I don't know how to put it. I love the movie Electra Woman and Dyna Girl, and it is geniusly put together to fulfill all of these things that you look for. Being faithful to the original material, giving you some new, giving you an every person story that every human being on this planet can empathize or sympathize with at different points. It gives you something that's not particularly complicated, but meaningful, and ends up giving you the basic values that all of the classic mythos of the great franchises in comic fandom were meant to convey. I mean, this is the stuff people wrote myths about in the ancient world. It's what Aesop's fables were about. Now we put a cape on it, and it's Superman, and it's Captain America with the shield, and it's Electra Woman and Dyna Girl. But it's that basic human story that's not surprising, but if it's told well, it gets inside us and tugs at our heartstrings. It re-encourages us in our humanity, our dignity, and our striving for goodness. Obviously, I could go on all day about this, but it's grossly underestimated as a film. Look it up. If you haven't seen it, watch it. Let me know what you think. If you have seen it, let me know what you think. Am I completely out of my mind? Am I overanalyzing it? Maybe. But it's rare these days that anything is around that I can enjoy as much as I enjoyed Electra Woman and Dyna Girl.